In the harsh, freezing winters of the medieval world, survival wasn't a guarantee. It was a daily battle. While lords and nobles feasted in their stone halls, peasants turned to the earth, drawing life from forgotten vegetables and humble meals. With no supermarkets, little meat, and few luxuries, they relied on clever cooking and deeply rooted knowledge passed down through generations. In this video, we'll uncover 20 of the cheap yet nutritious meals that medieval peasants used to stay alive, each centered around a powerful yet forgotten vegetable. 1. Turnip and barley pottage, meal of the muddy roads. In the cold heart of winter, when the land was frozen and the air smelled of wood smoke, there was one meal you could always count on to keep a medieval peasant alive: turnip and barley pottage. This humble dish was the soul of peasant cooking, filling, nutritious, and made from two ingredients that were cheap, easy to grow, and hard to ruin. Turnips were the true survival root. They grew in poor soil, needed little care, and could be stored for months in root cellars. Barley, though coarse and far less refined than wheat, was the backbone of the medieval diet. Together, they created a meal that was more than just food. It was sustenance in the truest sense of the word. Peasants would boil chopped turnips with barley grains for hours in a large iron pot over an open fire. If they were lucky, they might add a bit of onion, garlic, or wild herbs for flavor. On rare days, they would stir in a splash of animal fat, leftover bones, or even a few scraps of salted meat to enhance the richness. But most days, it was just barley, turnip, water, and thyme. This pottage was ladled into wooden bowls and eaten with chunks of stale bread to soak up the broth. It was often made in large batches to last for several days. Reheated over and over, the flavors would deepen and the texture would thicken until it resembled a stew more than a soup. It wasn't exciting, but it was survival, and for the peasant class, that was everything. 2. Parsnip porridge, sweet warmth on a cold morning. Before sugar was ever a common luxury, before cinnamon rolls or sweetened oatmeal, there was parsnip porridge, a medieval breakfast that brought unexpected warmth and sweetness to cold, gray mornings. Parsnips were the peasant's natural sweetener. When cooked, they became soft and slightly sugary, offering a rare sense of comfort in an otherwise flavorless diet. Combined with oats, water, and sometimes a bit of milk, if the cow was kind that day, this porridge was filling, affordable, and incredibly easy to make. The process began early in the morning. Water was boiled in a large clay or iron pot and oats were added and stirred until the porridge began to thicken. Meanwhile, parsnips were peeled and grated or chopped, then added to the pot and simmered until they softened and infused the mixture with a mellow, earthy sweetness. The result? A thick, creamy dish that felt far more luxurious than it actually was. For children especially, this meal was a treasured one. It was soft on the stomach and full of energy, a rare treat that gave strength for the long day ahead in the fields. On feast days or after a good harvest, peasants might even add a handful of dried berries or a drizzle of honey if it could be spared. But even without these extras, parsnip porridge was a reminder that nature could provide both nourishment and a touch of joy, if you knew where to look. 3. Cabbage and onion broth, the eternal boil. There are few meals that embody the spirit of medieval peasant life like cabbage and onion broth. It was basic, it was repetitive, but it was always there. Cabbage was one of the most common and durable vegetables of the time. It grew in almost any condition and could last well into the winter months. Onions added just enough bite and depth to make the dish feel like more than just boiled water. This broth wasn't so much a recipe as it was a ritual. The cabbage was chopped roughly, sometimes with the core still in, and thrown into a pot of water. Onions, whether fresh or dried, were added whole or in large slices. The mixture would boil for hours, bubbling softly over the hearth, filling the small cottage with steam and an unmistakable scent. In most cases, that was it. No meat, no salt, just the slow extraction of flavor from humble ingredients. But what it lacked in variety, it made up for in dependability. You could always make more. You could stretch it further. You could reheat it the next day and the day after, and it still filled your belly with warmth. Many peasants added stale bread directly into their bowls, letting it soak and soften in the broth, a medieval version of croutons. Others would fry the cabbage in fat before boiling it if they had any animal drippings saved from past meals. This broth wasn't delicious by modern standards, but to the peasants, it was life. It was warmth, nutrition, and routine. It was survival by boiling. 4. Leek and lentil stew, the poor man's protein. Protein was scarce for medieval peasants. Meat was a luxury, often reserved for the Lord's table, but one clever and affordable alternative came in the form of leek and lentil stew, a surprisingly satisfying dish that offered warmth, flavor, and energy all in one pot. Leeks were easier to grow than onions and could survive through colder months, making them an essential winter crop. Lentils, though not native to all parts of medieval Europe, were a common dried legume that could be stored for months and rehydrated when needed. This meal often began by sautéing chopped leeks in a bit of lard or oil, if available, until they were soft and fragrant. Lentils were then added with water and left to simmer until everything melded together into a thick, hearty stew. If garlic or herbs could be foraged, they were added too. Occasionally, a few root vegetables like carrots or turnips might join the mix. Peasants would eat this stew with wooden spoons, savoring every warm bite. It was especially popular during religious fasting days when meat was forbidden. The lentils gave a sense of richness and weight that mimicked the satisfaction of a meaty meal, even when none was present. In monasteries and peasant homes alike, leek and lentil stew was a sign that simplicity didn't have to mean starvation. It was a clever way to stretch resources and stay strong through even the harshest seasons. 5. Broadbean mash on rye bread, the field worker's fuel. If you were a laborer in the fields, swinging tools from dawn until dusk, you needed a meal that was dense, protein-rich, and portable. Enter broadbean mash on rye bread, a medieval version of toast with a spread, made for those who had no time to sit but every need to eat. Broadbeans, also known as fava beans, were a staple crop across Europe. They were easy to grow, dried well for storage, and packed with plant-based protein. Rye, meanwhile, was the peasant's grain. It made dark, coarse bread that was tougher and more bitter than wheat, but far more affordable and durable. To make this dish, broad beans were boiled until soft, then mashed with a wooden spoon or pestle. A bit of garlic, salt, if they had it, or herbs might be added. The mash was then spread onto thick slices of rye bread, often hard from days of sitting in storage. This wasn't a sit-down dinner. It was a meal meant to be eaten while working, walking, or warming up after a cold day. The beans gave strength, the bread gave bulk. It was peasant fuel. No frills, no fire needed, just nutrition on the go. And in its own quiet way, it showed how even the simplest ingredients, when paired with creativity and necessity, could keep a people going, one mouthful at a time. 6. Nettle and Oat Soup, the wild green lifesaver. When the earth was just beginning to stir after a long winter and gardens were still bare, peasants turned to the wild. And one of the most overlooked but life-saving greens was the stinging nettle, transformed into a nourishing and surprisingly rich meal known as nettle and oat soup. Nettles were feared for their sting, but loved for their healing power. They were one of the first plants to appear in early spring, making them a crucial source of vitamins and iron after a nutrient-deprived winter. Peasants would forage them carefully, often wearing cloth over their hands to avoid the painful sting, which disappeared once the leaves were cooked. In a large pot, water was brought to a boil, and chopped nettles were added. Oats, cheap and always available, were stirred in next, creating a thick, green porridge-like soup. The oats absorbed the mineral-rich broth, and the nettles gave the meal a taste somewhere between spinach and earth. Some families added leeks or garlic if they had it, A spoon of lard or butter would transform the humble dish into something approaching luxury. Though the taste was simple, this soup carried the strength of the new season in every bowl. It was the body's wake-up call after months of bland food. It gave peasants their first taste of spring and reminded them that the land, even in its wildest corners, could still provide. 7. Rudabagga and root vegetable bake. Winter's last stand. As winter dragged on and food stores thinned, peasants leaned on their root cellars, and few vegetables held up better in the cold than the rudabagga. Combined with other stored roots like carrots, parsnips, and turnips, they created a filling, layered meal, the rudabagga and root vegetable bake. This dish wasn't baked in ovens as we know them, but rather slow-cooked near open hearths or in covered clay pots buried in hot embers. The vegetables were peeled and sliced, then layered in simple earthenware pots, rudabaggas forming the base, followed by thin rounds of carrot, turnip, and onion. Water or thin broth was poured in to steam the dish slowly, and if a peasant had access to animal drippings or dairy fat, it would be added for richness. The meal was then covered and left to simmer for hours. When served, the vegetables were soft and infused with one another's flavors. The rudabagga, with its mild sweetness and starch, acted almost like a potato substitute, satisfying and dense. For a people facing dwindling food supplies at winter's end, this dish was gold. It wasn't flashy, but it was hope in edible form, stretching every scrap of the harvest into something warm, filling, and deeply grounding. At 8. Sorrel and Barley Gl. The tang of the land. In the days before refrigeration or artificial flavoring, peasants craved anything that broke the monotony of bland food. And sorrel, a wild green with a lemony bite, was the rare plant that delivered a burst of flavor straight from the earth. One of the most overlooked but vital peasant meals was sorrel and barley gruel, a zesty twist on an otherwise bland staple. Barley gruel was a default dish, barley boiled in water until thick. It was easy to make and easy to digest, but it lacked excitement until you added sorrel. Gathered from meadows and forest edges, sorrel's sharp taste cut through the heaviness of the gruel, giving the meal freshness and brightness. The leaves were shredded and stirred in toward the end of cooking, just long enough to soften but not lose their character. If available, garlic or vinegar might be added to sharpen the dish even more. Some even stirred in crushed nettles or other foraged greens for variety. This meal was most popular in late spring and early summer when sorrel was at its peak. It reminded peasants of the land's generosity, not just in calories, but in taste. For many, this wasn't just food. It was a small moment of joy in a world that often offered very few. Horseradish flatbread, wraps, spice without wealth. In a time when imported spices were reserved for kings and monasteries, peasants found their own ways to bring heat and intensity to their food. And one of the boldest flavors came not from overseas, but from the ground beneath their feet: horseradish. Known for its fiery kick, horseradish root was grated and mixed into dough to create a pungent, chewy flatbread, a kind of medieval wrap that made even the simplest greens or boiled vegetables feel like a feast. The dough was made from coarse rye or barley flour, water, and a bit of salt. Grated horseradish root was added to the mix, making the entire bread spicy and invigorating. These flatbreads were shaped by hand and cooked on hot stones or metal griddles near the fire. They were often eaten wrapped around cabbage, wild greens, onions, or leftover stew. For peasants who ate the same dishes every day, the sting of horseradish was a welcome jolt, something that made you feel alive in the cold and damp. Beyond taste, horseradish was also considered medicinal. It was thought to clear the lungs, warm the body, and drive away sickness, a sort of spicy armor against the dark winter months. Cheap, fiery, and unforgettable, these wraps were a reminder that even the poorest meals could have personality. 10. Chicory leaf and bean stew, bitterness and strength. In a world of heavy starches and greasy drippings, bitterness had a purpose, and no plant embodied that more than chicory. Its tough, bitter leaves were used in one of the most honest peasant meals, the chicory leaf and bean stew. This wasn't a dish of comfort. It was a dish of necessity and resilience. Chicory leaves, foraged or grown, were boiled to reduce their bitterness, then added to stews of white beans or broad beans. These legumes, soaked overnight and slow cooked for hours, gave the meal bulk and protein, while the chicory added fiber, vitamins, and a deep, earthy taste. Some peasants boiled chicory in 2 rounds of water to make it more palatable. Others embraced the sharpness, believing it to cleanse the body and sharpen the senses. Garlic, vinegar, or even ashes from the hearth were sometimes added to cut the bitterness or add trace minerals. When bread was dipped into this dark, dense stew, it became a powerful, grounding meal that stuck to your bones. Though it might not appeal to modern palates, this was a survival dish, nutrient-dense, strengthening, and honest to the land. It tasted like hard work, but it gave you the strength to keep going. 11. Skirit and carrot pottage, the sweet roots of resilience. Long before sugar became widespread, peasants found sweetness where they could, deep in the soil. And 2 roots brought that natural sweetness to life, skirit and carrot. When boiled together into a thick, creamy stew, they formed a humble but satisfying meal, skirit and carrot pottage. Skirit, now nearly forgotten, was a sweet root vegetable with a texture similar to parsnip but with a unique flavor, somewhere between sugarcane and mild pepper. In medieval times, it was considered a delicacy by peasants lucky enough to grow or forage it. Carrots, in their original purple or white forms, were another important crop. Together, these roots were peeled, chopped, and simmered slowly with water, a handful of barley, and maybe a few onions or herbs. Over time, the vegetables would soften and break down into a thick, rich base, naturally sweet and nourishing. When served, it was like a bowl of warmth. Even on the hardest days, when frost covered the fields and the wind howled through thatched roofs, this dish reminded peasants that the earth still held a touch of kindness. Simple, sweet, strong. That's what skirit and carrot pottage was all about. Fennel frond and pea pottage, the scent of simplicity. If you walked into a medieval peasant's cottage and caught the faint scent of licorice and grass, chances are they were making fennel frond and pea pottage. Fennel was a gift from the garden. Its feathery leaves and stalks added flavor to otherwise bland meals. Peasants didn't waste any part of the plant. While the bulb was rarely available in quantity, the fronds were free and fragrant. Dried peas, stored from the harvest, were the base. Cheap, protein-rich, and filling. To prepare this meal, dried peas were soaked overnight and boiled into a mushy stew. As they simmered, fennel fronds were added, either fresh or dried, infusing the pot with a sweet, anise-like aroma. If garlic or leeks were available, they'd join in. On a lucky day, a splash of oil or a spoonful of dripping gave it an extra edge. Served hot, this dish warmed the bones and opened the lungs. Fennel was believed to aid digestion and keep the body clear in the colder months. It was a healer and a flavor bringer, turning a basic protein mush into something gentle and wholesome. Even in scarcity, there was room for a little elegance. 13. Alexander's and wild barley salad, the forgotten green table. Long before parsley, celery, and spinach became kitchen staples, there was a leafy green called Alexander's, a plant that once grew abundantly across medieval Europe, but has since vanished from our tables. When combined with grains, it created a surprisingly fresh dish, Alexander's and wild barley salad. This wasn't a salad in the modern sense, but rather a cool, grain-based meal often eaten during warmer seasons or after days of heavy stew. Alexander's, with a flavor somewhere between celery and parsley, were foraged and chopped finely. Boiled barley, often leftover from a pottage, served as the base. The two were tossed together with whatever herbs or souring agents were available, usually vinegar, and if incredibly lucky, a splash of oil. The salad might also include wild onions, dandelion greens, or a few shreds of cheese from the household goat. This meal was often eaten cold, scooped with bread, or served alongside a bowl of broth. It gave peasants a break from heat-heavy meals and allowed them to use what the fields gave freely. It was the medieval version of fresh and light, and it reminded people that not all survival meals had to be boiled to death. 14. Salsifi fry cakes, the poor man's fritter. Hidden in the hedgerows and damp earth was a strange and creamy root called salsifi, known by some as the oyster plant for its unique flavor when cooked. For peasants, it was a lucky find, and when there was a bit of flour and fat to spare, they turned it into a comfort food, salsifi fry cakes. This dish required a bit of work, but the result was worth it. Salsifi roots were peeled, grated, and mixed with a handful of flour, often barley or rye flour. A bit of water, salt, and herbs created a thick batter, which was then dropped in spoonfuls onto a hot, oiled pan over the fire. The cakes would crisp up around the edges while remaining creamy inside, soft, savory, and satisfying. On feast days, or if eggs were available, the batter might be enriched further, but even plain, the result was indulgent by peasant standards. Fry cakes were eaten hot, sometimes dipped in broth, and occasionally stuffed with greens or bits of leftover pottage. They were portable, filling, and wildly underrated. For a people who had little luxury, this dish was a stolen moment of joy, crispy, warm, and undeniably comforting. 15. Good King Henry soup, the peasant's spinach. Before spinach was a supermarket staple, peasants had a perennial green known as Good King Henry, a plant that grew wild in meadows and near cottages, ready to be picked nearly year-round. Its leaves were dark, rich in minerals, and perfect for one of the most faithful medieval dishes, Good King Henry soup. The leaves were boiled gently, often with onions or leeks, and then blended, or more accurately smashed, with breadcrumbs or oats to create a thick green soup. On some days, leftover broth from a meat boil might be added for depth, but usually water had to suffice. The soup had a slightly bitter, earthy flavor, which peasants often softened with vinegar, sour milk, or a bit of animal fat. Garlic was a welcome addition when available. It was simple and humble, but it was also deeply healing. Rich in iron and folate, Good King Henry helped rebuild strength after illness or exhaustion. Mothers gave it to their children. Elderly peasants swore by it for vitality. In every sip, there was a reminder. Strength doesn't always come from meat or gold. It sometimes grows quietly in the grass outside your door. 16. Jerusalem artichoke bake. Underground gold. Hidden beneath the soil like buried treasure, Jerusalem artichokes were a strange and starchy tuber that peasants prized for one simple reason. They grew like weeds. With little care and no special tools needed, these knobby roots gave birth to a rustic favorite, the Jerusalem artichoke bake. Despite their name, Jerusalem artichokes aren't artichokes at all. They're part of the sunflower family. Peasants would dig them up in late autumn, wash off the dirt, and slice them thin. With a bit of oil or animal fat, they'd layer the slices with onions or leeks in a clay pot, add water or leftover broth, and cook the whole thing low and slow by the hearth. The result was soft, almost buttery slices of root layered into a kind of peasant casserole. It was dense, filling, and had a nutty flavor that made it feel almost decadent, even without meat or cheese. And here's the best part. Jerusalem artichokes were hard to kill. Even if the tops were cut down or the land neglected, the tubers kept multiplying underground. For peasants facing famine or land restrictions, that meant one thing: a secret food supply. To the medieval poor, this bake wasn't just dinner. It was security beneath the soil. 17. Wild garlic and peasant cheese tart, a rare indulgence. In a life of repetition and restraint, there were still rare occasions when a peasant could indulge. And when they could, they made something special: the wild garlic and peasant cheese tart. This dish was a celebration of the short, brilliant season when wild garlic blanketed the forest floors. Its broad green leaves and white blossoms gave off a pungent, mouth-watering aroma that no hungry villager could resist. The leaves were picked fresh and finely chopped, then mixed with soft, crumbly cheese made from goat or sheep's milk, known as peasant cheese. The filling was poured into a basic dough shell made from barley or rye flour and baked over hot stones or in the embers of a fire pit. The tart was simple but packed with flavor: sharp garlic, creamy cheese, and a rustic crust that crackled with every bite. These were shared during village feasts or after a good trade at the market. Often, a single tart would be cut into thin slices so everyone could have a bite. For peasants, this meal wasn't just about nutrition, it was about reminding themselves that life had more to offer than struggle. 18. Lamb's lettuce and vinegar broth, a winter cleanser. When the body was tired from months of heavy food and the mind dulled by winter's grayness, peasants turned to the light, cleansing power of lamb's lettuce. This delicate, cold-weather green gave rise to a humble but restorative meal: lamb's lettuce and vinegar broth. Unlike the cultivated lettuces we know today, lamb's lettuce grew wild in winter and early spring, often appearing when little else would. It had a soft texture and a slightly nutty taste, making it perfect for a simple warm broth. The greens were washed and dropped into hot water or leftover onion stock. A small splash of vinegar, often homemade from spoiled cider or wine, was added to balance the flavors and wake up the palate. Sometimes dried herbs or garlic were stirred in, and stale bread was crumbled into the broth to thicken it. But mostly, the dish remained light and clean, a gentle break from the usual heaviness of medieval meals. Peasants believed this broth helped clean the blood after winter and brought new energy to the limbs. It was a dish of hope, eaten at the edge of spring. 19. Yellow beetroot and bean stew, golden richness from the soil. Before the bright red beets we know today, medieval peasants grew and consumed yellow beetroot, a mellow, golden root that added color and body to one of their most nourishing meals: yellow beetroot and bean stew. Beans were everywhere in the peasant diet, cheap, easy to store, and filling. But on their own, they could be monotonous. Yellow beetroot changed that. It added sweetness, softness, and visual warmth to an otherwise dull pot. Peasants would soak dried beans overnight, then boil them slowly with chunks of yellow beetroot, leeks or onions, and garlic if they had it. The beets would tint the stew a soft yellow and dissolve slightly into the broth, creating a rich, earthy flavor. When served, the stew was eaten with rye bread or by the spoonful straight from the pot. It was ideal for long workdays or cold evenings by the fire, and best of all, the ingredients were accessible to even the poorest villagers. This stew was the kind of food that didn't just feed your belly, it brightened your day. 20. Watercress and lentil soup, healing in a bowl. In the medieval world, when illness struck and medicine was scarce, peasants turned to what they knew best: nature. And one of the most revered healing plants was watercress, found near clean streams and springs. Combined with protein-rich lentils, it made one of the most respected meals in the peasant kitchen: watercress and lentil soup. Watercress was known for its sharp, peppery bite and high mineral content. It was believed to purify the blood, sharpen the senses, and restore vitality. Peasants gathered it fresh and rinsed it in cold water, then stirred it into boiling lentils, along with garlic, onions, and sometimes a splash of vinegar. The lentils offered strength, the watercress, healing. Together they formed a meal that was as medicinal as it was nourishing. This soup was often made for the sick, the elderly, or women recovering after childbirth. It was simple, but sacred, part of a tradition that saw food as the first and most essential form of care. Even now, it stands as a reminder that the line between survival and healing was once drawn with nothing more than lentils and leaves.